Way of St. James.
The Way of St. James or St. James's Way is the name of any of the pilgrimage routes to the shrine of the Apostle St. James the Great in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Galicia in northwestern Spain, where tradition has it that the remains of the saint are buried.
Major Christian pilgrimage route.
The Way of St. James was one of the most important Christian pilgrimages during medieval times, together with Rome and Jerusalem, and a pilgrimage route on which a plenary indulgence could be earned. Other major pilgrimage routes include the Via Francigena to Rome and the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Legend holds that St. James's remains were carried by boat from Jerusalem to northern Spain, where he was buried on the site of what is now the city of Santiago de Compostela. The way can take one of any number of pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela. Traditionally, as with most pilgrimages, the Way of St. James began at one's home and ended at the pilgrimage site. However, a few of the routes are considered main ones. During the Middle Ages, the route was highly travelled. However, the Black Death, the Protestant Reformation and political unrest in 16th-century Europe led to its decline. By the 1980s, only a few pilgrims per year arrived in Santiago. Later, the route attracted a growing number of modern-day pilgrims from around the globe. The route was declared the first European cultural route by the Council of Europe in October 1987. It was also named one of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites. Whenever St. James's Day, July 25, falls on a Sunday, the cathedral declares a holy or jubilee year. Depending on leap years, holy years occur in 5, 6 and 11-year intervals. The most recent were 1982, 1993, 1999, 2004, and 2010. The next will be 2021, 2027, and 2032.
History.
The pilgrimage to Santiago has never ceased from the time of the discovery of St. James's remains, though there have been years of fewer pilgrims, particularly during European wars. During the War of American Independence, John Adams was ordered by Congress to go to Paris to obtain funds for the cause. His ship started leaking and he disembarked with his 2 sons in Finisterre in 1779. From there he proceeded to follow the Way of St. James in the reverse direction of the pilgrim's route, in order to get to Paris overland. He did not stop to visit Santiago and came to regret this during the course of his journey. In his autobiography, he gave an accurate description of the customs and lodgings afforded to St. James pilgrims in the 18th century and mentioned the legend as it was then told to travellers.
Pre-Christian history.
The Christian origin of the pilgrimage has been well documented throughout the centuries, but no historical reference has been found for pagan origins. The main pilgrimage route to Santiago follows an earlier Roman trade route, which continues to the Atlantic coast of Galicia, ending at Cape Finisterre. Although it is known today that Cape Finisterre, Spain's westernmost point, is not the westernmost point of mainland Europe, Cabo da Roca in Portugal is farther west. The fact that the Romans called it Finisterrae, literally the end of the world or Land's End in Latin, indicates that they viewed it as such. At night, the Milky Way overhead seems to point the way, so the route acquired the nickname La Vogla di the Milky Way.
Scallop symbol.
The scallop shell, often found on the shores in Galicia, has long been the symbol of the Camino de Santiago. Over the centuries the scallop shell has taken on mythical, metaphorical and practical meanings, even if its relevance may actually derive from the desire of pilgrims to take home a souvenir. 2 versions of the most common myth about the origin of the symbol concern the death of St. James, who was martyred by beheading in Jerusalem in 44 CE. According to Spanish legends, he had spent time preaching the gospel in Spain, but returned to Judea upon seeing a vision of the Virgin Mary on the bank of the Bro River. The scallop shell also acts as a metaphor. The grooves in the shell, which meet at a single point, represent the various routes pilgrims traveled, eventually arriving at a single destination, the tomb of James in Santiago de Compostela. The shell is also a metaphor for the pilgrim, as the waves of the ocean wash scallop shells up onto the shores of Galicia, God's hand also guides the pilgrims to Santiago. As the symbol of the Camino de Santiago, the shell is seen very frequently along the trails. The shell is seen on posts and signs along the Camino in order to guide pilgrims along the way. The shell is even more commonly seen on the pilgrims themselves. Wearing a shell denotes that you are a traveler on the Camino de Santiago. Most pilgrims receive a shell at the beginning of their journey and either attach it to them by sewing it onto their clothes or wearing it around their neck or by simply keeping it in their backpack. The scallop shell also served practical purposes for pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago. The shell was the right size for gathering water to drink or for eating out of as a makeshift bowl. The pilgrim's staff is a walking stick used by pilgrims to the shrine of Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Generally, the stick has a hook on it so that something may be hung from it, and may have a cross piece on it.
Medieval route.
The earliest records of visits paid to the shrine dedicated to St. James at Santiago de Compostela date from the 9th century, in the time of the Kingdom of Asturias. The pilgrimage to the shrine became the most renowned medieval pilgrimage, and it became customary for those who returned from Compostela to carry back with them a Galician scallop shell as proof of their completion of the journey. This practice was gradually extended to other pilgrimages. The earliest recorded pilgrims from beyond the Pyrenees visited the shrine in the middle of the 11th century, but it seems that it was not until a century later that large numbers of pilgrims from abroad were regularly journeying there. The earliest records of pilgrims that arrived from England belong to the period between 1092 and 1105. However, by the early 12th century the pilgrimage had become a highly organized affair. One of the great proponents of the pilgrimage in the 12th century was Pope Calixtus II, who started the Compostelan Holy Years. The official guide in those times was the Codex Calixtinus. Published around 1140, the fifth book of the Codex is still considered the definitive source for many modern guidebooks. 4 pilgrimage routes listed in the Codex originate in France and converge at Puente-la-Reina. From there, a well-defined route crosses northern Spain, linking Burgos, Carrion de los Condes, Sahagún, Leon, Astorga, and Compostela. The daily needs of pilgrims on their way to and from Compostela were met by a series of hospitals and hospices. These had royal protection and were a lucrative source of revenue. Romanesque architecture, a new genre of ecclesiastical architecture, was designed with massive archways to cope with huge devout crowds. There was also the sale of the now familiar paraphernalia of tourism, such as badges and souvenirs. Since the Christian symbol for James the Greater was the scallop shell, many pilgrims wore one as a sign to anyone on the road that they were a pilgrim. This gave them privileges to sleep in churches and ask for free meals, but also warded off thieves who dared not attack devoted pilgrims. The pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela was possible because of the protection and freedom provided by the Kingdom of France, where the majority of pilgrims originated. Enterprising French, including Gascons and other peoples not under the French crown, settled in towns along the pilgrimage routes, where their names appear in the archives. The pilgrims were tended by people like Domingo de la Calzada, who was later recognized as a saint himself. Pilgrims walked the way of St. James, often for months, to arrive at the great church in the main square of Compostela and pay homage to St. James. So many pilgrims have laid their hands on the pillar just inside the doorway of the church that a groove has been worn in the stone. The popular Spanish name for the astronomical Milky Way is El Camino de Santiago. According to a common medieval legend, the Milky Way was formed from the dust raised by traveling pilgrims. Compostela itself means field of stars. Another origin for this popular name is Book 4 of the Book of St. James, which relates how the saint appeared in a dream to Charlemagne, urging him to liberate his tomb from the Moors and showing him the direction to follow by the route of the Milky Way.
As penance.
The Church employed a system of rituals to atone for temporal punishment due to sins known as penance. According to this system, pilgrimages were a suitable form of expiation for some temporal punishment, and they could be used as acts of penance for those who were guilty of certain crimes. as noted in the Catholic Encyclopedia. There is still a tradition in Flanders of pardoning and releasing one prisoner every year under the condition that this prisoner walks to Santiago wearing a heavy backpack, accompanied by a guard.
Modern-day pilgrimage.
Today, tens of thousands of Christian pilgrims and many others set out each year from their front doorsteps or from popular starting points across Europe, to make their way to Santiago de Compostela. Most travel by foot, some by bicycle, and a few travel as some of their medieval counterparts did, on horseback or by donkey, for example, the British author and humorist Tim Moore. In addition to those undertaking a religious pilgrimage, the majority are hikers who walk the route for non-religious reasons, travel, sport, or simply the challenge of weeks of walking in a foreign land. Also, many consider the experience a spiritual adventure to remove themselves from the bustle of modern life. It serves as a retreat for many modern pilgrims.
Routes.
Pilgrims on the way of St. James walk for weeks or months to visit the city of Santiago de Compostela. They follow many routes. Any path to Santiago is a pilgrim's path, but the most popular route is Via Regia and its last part, the French way, Camino Francis. Historically, most of the pilgrims come from France, from Paris, Vézelay, La Feuille, and Arles and St. Gilles, due to the Codex Calixtinus, and which today are important starting points. The Spanish consider the Pyrenees a starting point. Common starting points along the French border are Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port or Somport on the French side of the Pyrenees and Roncesvalles or Jaca on the Spanish side. The distance from Roncesvalles to Santiago de Compostela through Leon is about 800 kilometers. Another possibility is to do the northern route nearer the Spanish coast along the Bay of Biscay, which was first used by pilgrims in order to avoid traveling through the territories occupied by the Muslims in the Middle Ages. Many pilgrims begin further afield in one of the four French cities that are common and traditional starting points or gathering points: Paris, Vézelay, Arles, and La Feuille. Cluny, site of the celebrated medieval abbey, was another important rallying point for pilgrims and, in 2002, it was integrated into the official European pilgrimage route linking Vézelay and La Feuille. Some pilgrims start from even further away, though their routes will often pass through one of those four French towns. Some Europeans begin their pilgrimage on foot from the very doorstep of their homes, just as their medieval counterparts did. Another popular route is the Portuguese Way, which starts either at the Cathedral in Lisbon, for a total of about 610 kilometers, or at the Cathedral in Porto in the north of Portugal, for a total of about 227 kilometers, crossing into Galicia Valenca.
Accommodation.
In Spain, France, and Portugal, pilgrims' hostels with beds and dormitories dot the common routes, providing overnight accommodation for pilgrims who hold a credential, see below. In Spain this type of accommodation is called a refugio or albergue, both of which are similar to youth hostels or hostelries in the French system of gîtes type. Staying at pilgrims' hostels, known as albergues, usually costs between €6 and €10 per night per bed, although a few hostels known as donativos operate on voluntary donations. Municipal albergues cost €6, while private albergues generally cost between €10 and €15 per night. Pilgrims are usually limited to one night's accommodation and are expected to leave by 8 in the morning to continue their pilgrimage. Hostels may be run by the local parish, the local council, private owners, or pilgrims' associations. Occasionally these refugios are located in monasteries, such as the one run by monks in Samos, Spain and the one in Santiago de Compostela.
Credential or pilgrim's passport.
Most pilgrims carry a document called the Credential, purchased for a few euros from a Spanish tourist agency, a church on the route, or from their church back home. The Credential is a pass which gives access to inexpensive, sometimes free, overnight accommodation in refugios along the trail. Also known as the Pilgrim's Passport, the Credential is stamped with the official St. James stamp of each town or refugio at which the pilgrim has stayed. It provides pilgrims with a record of where they ate or slept, but also serves as proof to the Pilgrims office in Santiago that the journey was accomplished according to an official route. The Credential is available at refugios, tourist offices, some local parish houses, and outside Spain through the National St. James organization of that country. The stamped Credential is also necessary if the pilgrim wants to obtain a Compostela, a certificate of completion of the pilgrimage. Most often the stamp can be obtained in the refugio, cathedral, or local church. If the church is closed, the town hall or office of tourism can provide a stamp, as well as nearby youth hostels or private St. James addresses. Outside Spain, the stamp can be associated with something of a ceremony, where the stamper and the pilgrim can share information. As the pilgrimage approaches Santiago, many of the stamps in small towns are self-service due to the greater number of pilgrims, while in the larger towns there are several options to obtain the stamp.
Compostela.
The Compostela is a certificate of accomplishment given to pilgrims on completing the way. To earn the Compostela one needs to walk a minimum of 100 kilometers or cycle at least 200 kilometers. In practice, for walkers, the closest convenient point to start is Sarria, as it has good bus and rail connections to other places in Spain. Pilgrims arriving in Santiago de Compostela who have walked at least the last 100 kilometers, or cycled 200 kilometers to get there, as indicated on their credential, and who state that their motivation was at least partially religious are eligible for the Compostela from the Pilgrims office in Santiago. At the Pilgrims office the credential is examined for stamps and dates, and the pilgrim is asked to state whether the motivation in traveling the Camino was religious and other, or other. In the case of religious and other a Compostela is available. In the case of other there is a simpler certificate in Spanish. The Compostela has been indulgenced since the early Middle Ages and remains so to this day. The full text of the certificate is in Latin and reads: English translation. The simpler certificate of completion in Spanish for those with non-religious motivation reads: English translation. The Pilgrims office gives more than 100,000 Compostelas each year to pilgrims from more than 100 different countries.
Pilgrims Mass.
A Pilgrims Mass is held in the Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela each day at noon for pilgrims. Pilgrims who received the Compostela the day before have their countries of origin and the starting point of their pilgrimage announced at the Mass. The musical and visual highlight of the Mass is the synchronization of the beautiful hymn to Santiago with the spectacular swinging of the huge Botafumeiro, the famous thurible kept in the cathedral. Incense is burned in this swinging metal container, or censer. As the last chords die away, the multitude of pilgrims jostle happily as they crowd forward to reach the spiritual highlight of the Mass, the rite of communion. Priests administer the sacrament of penance, or confession, in many languages, permitting most pilgrims to complete the indulgence attached to the pilgrimage upon satisfying the other canonical conditions. In the Holy Year of 2010 the Pilgrims Mass was exceptionally held 4 times a day, at 10:00 am, noon, 6:00 p.m., and 7:30 p.m., catering for the greater number of pilgrims arriving in the Holy Year.
As tourism.
The Xunta de Galicia, Galicia's regional government, promotes the way as a tourist activity, particularly in Holy Compostelan years, when July 25 falls on a Sunday. Following the Xunta's considerable investment and hugely successful advertising campaign for the Holy Year of 1993, the number of pilgrims completing the route has been steadily rising. Following the Holy Year of 2010, your next Holy Year will not be for another 11 years, in 2021. More than 272,000 pilgrims made the trip during the course of 2010. Below is a table detailing the numbers of pilgrims recorded as arriving at the cathedral at Santiago each year from 1985. The figures are sourced from the cathedral's records.
In television and film.
1969 The pilgrimage is central to the plot of the 1969 film The Milky Way by surrealist director Louis Buñuel. It is intended to be a critique of the Catholic Church, as the modern pilgrims encounter various manifestations of Catholic dogma and heresy. 2003 art critic and journalist Brian Sewell made a journey to Santiago de Compostela for a television series The Naked Pilgrim for UK's Channel 5 in 2003. Travelling by car along the French route, he visited many towns and cities on the way including Paris, Chartres, Roncesvalles, Burgos, Lyon and Fromester. Sewell, a lapsed Catholic, was moved by the stories of other pilgrims and by the sights he saw. The series climaxed with Sewell's emotional response to the Mass at Compostela. 2004 In 2004 an Australian filmmaker walked the French way from Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port to Santiago, documenting his experiences in a documentary called The Way. 2005 One Day in Europe is a film directed by Hans Stu. The film was nominated for Golden Bear Award at the 2005 Berlin Film Festival. One Day in Europe consists of 4 stories which take place on a single day in 4 different cities: Berlin, Istanbul, Moscow and Santiago de Compostela. 2005 In 2005, The Way of St. James was the central feature of the film St. Jacques Lamech directed by Colin Serrault. 2008 Part of the pilgrimage route is walked and described in the American food and travel television series produced by PBS Spain. On the Road Again, in Episode 2, Pilgrimage to Galicia. It originally aired September 27, 2008. 2010 In the Way, a movie starring Martin Sheen and Emilio Estevez, who also wrote and directed. The principal character walked the way of St. James. A father learns that his son has died on the route and takes up the pilgrimage in order to complete it for his son. The film was presented at the Toronto International Film Festival in September 2010, and premiered in Santiago in November 2010. 2011 The Huffington Post featured an article and short documentary video on walking the Camino de Santiago in March 2011. On his Travel Europe television series, PBS, US, Rick Steves covers northern Spain and the Camino de Santiago in Series 6. The cited reference contains information about this episode and resources for the trip as well as blog posts and user comments. Danish TV and radio personality Michael Bertelsen walked part of the route, from Lyon to Santiago, in the Nordic Christmas calendar series Bertelsen par Camino N. Despite early skepticism from the religious community, who feared that the journey would be ridiculed in Bertelsen's usual style, the series was very well received. 2013 Lydia B. Smith produced and directed a documentary called Walking the Camino, 6 Ways to Santiago about 6 strangers from around the world who walk the Camino de Santiago. 2013 Simon Reeve presented the Pilgrimage series on BBC Two in which he followed various pilgrimage routes across Europe including the Camino de Santiago in Episode 2.
Name in other languages.
In France and the Iberian Peninsula, the local names of the Way of St. James are as follows. Galician, O Camino de Santiago or Ruta Xacobea, Spanish, El Camino de Santiago, Basque, Dona de Cabide, Portuguese, O Caminho de Santiago, French, Le Chemin de Saint-Jacques. Pilgrims across Europe traveling along the route, even in France and the Iberian Peninsula, will refer to the Way of St. James in their own languages. Note that, there are ancient and modern pilgrimage routes Compostela through many countries in Europe connecting to the routes in France and then to Spain. Routes exist in Switzerland, Germany, Austria and Italy among many other European nations, and all these are part of the network of routes to Compostela. Italian, Il Camino di Santiago di Compostela, German, Der Jagdweg, Dutch, St. Jacob's Route, Polish, Droga Świętego Jakuba. Regardless of their native tongue, pilgrims along the various routes in Spain will often exchange the Spanish greeting Buen Camino, literally meaning good road.
In literature.
Paulo Coelho, The Pilgrimage, 1987, Kevin A. Code, To the Field of Stars, A Pilgrim's Journey to Santiago de Compostela, 2008, James Mycona, Iberia, 1968. Contains one chapter about the Camino de Santiago. Walter Starkey, The Road to Santiago, 1957, John Murray, reprinted 2003, David Lodge, Therapy, 1995, Anne Carson, Kinds of Water, first published in 1987. A prose poem that traces the narrator's journey, focusing on the philosophical questions it raises, especially with regards to the nature and desire of the pilgrim. The piece can be found in the 1995 anthology of Carson's essays Plain Water, Shirley MacLaine, Camino, Journey of the Spirit.